So we're going to go ahead and get started today, and we're on John chapter 10, and we're going to try to do something today, and we're actually going to do it one way or the other. We're going to do two chapters. I'm going to try to do chapter 10 and do some justice to it, but not get too bogged down in some of the nuts and bolts of this. Last time we were here, I mentioned the fact that chapter 6, chapter 8, and chapter 10 of the book of John are highly theological chapters to this book. There are discourses that Jesus is having with the Pharisees, and he makes a number of statements that I think are difficult to actually to figure out exactly what he meant, unless you just change the entire way you look at Scripture at some point in time. And that's okay too. I think it is important to be challenged with some of the presuppositions that we carry with us just because of our backgrounds. And everybody's got a different background, so they have a different opinion about certain things. But we're going to cover a few of these, but today we're going to talk in John chapter 10. And, I told you last time that when we did our review that we were going to maybe I could come up with a different slide. So this is our passage in John chapter 20, verse 30, which is making this point about how John's purpose of this book is that you would believe, and that by believing you'll have life in his name. So I was working on a slide yesterday, and this is a thought I came up with. There you go. Look, it's all animated, everything. So the purpose of this book is to get you to believe, and we see that word used over and over and over and over in the book of John, and it's the point that Jesus is making to the Pharisees and to the people that listen to him preach. And even in the message of John the Baptist was to prepare the people for the coming of the Messiah, and thus by his very name would imply that he was the chosen one, that he was God's son, that he was the one who would bring salvation to the people of Israel. So last week we talked about the blind man, and I can't help but at least revisit that a bit. Because it does bring up this discussion, not that just somebody historically had their vision fixed so that they could see, and in spite of the fact he was born blind, he was now able to see. And there's some implications with that, and if we don't talk about them, we've missed the whole point of why Jesus did this, and we also missed the point why John actually included this in his gospel, was because he wanted them to realize that there was this concept of spiritual blindness that some of us have, and some of that blindness could actually have occurred in the course of your life, as we see in some of those passages of blind people being healed. But in this particular passage in John chapter 9, we have a person who had never seen. He was born blind and was blind for how many years? His whole life. That's true. But there's this implication about spiritual blindness that Jesus tries to really hit home with people, is that there are people who are spiritually blind. And to some degree, all of us have been spiritually blind at some point in our lives and may have been brought to sight and then gone spiritually blind again. But spiritual blindness is for real. And I think it's the questions that we all need to ask ourselves about this is, why was he blind? And how about us? Are we blind? And I think that anytime you read in the Bible and the New Testament and you read the teachings of Jesus, and you can take this home, if you walk around and patting yourself on the back because of something that Jesus said, that you said, man, I'm really glad I'm not spiritually blind, you have missed the entire point and the entire message of the New Testament. And I think it is something that we should all continually be challenged with when we read the stories of the Pharisees, that we try to not be a Pharisee. And that when we read the story of a person who's been blind his entire life, that we might stop and think about how we've been blinded our entire lives also. So I think these teachings, especially in the book of John, are serious. I think they're extremely strong teachings and important for us to constantly be reminded about what the message really was. So in John chapter 10, this is actually referred to most often as the Discourse of the Good Shepherd. And I find some of the analogies that we read in these passages to be a little confusing at times, because there's so many different characters that Jesus talks about. But the passages in talking about the Good Shepherd just brings up the idea about sheep and shepherd that we read about throughout the Bible. Jesus makes numerous comments, and we'll read a few of those passages about what it meant to be a shepherd. If you go back and look in the Old Testament, it's a common theme in the Old Testament, especially in Isaiah, about the sheep and the shepherd. I think that probably some of the more difficult passages for us to read, especially if you're an elder, if you read, Ezekiel chapter 34, where Ezekiel is condemning the leaders of Israel and holds them to a higher standard than everybody else because they are the shepherd and they're neglecting their job as shepherd to the sheep, and very, very critical of that. But we see so many other passages. But if you look in the New Testament, and this is just sort of an interesting thing that John is a little unique, as we pointed out over and over and over, that we see and depending on which version of the New Testament you might read, that the occurrences of the word sheep is 43, but only five of them are outside of the Gospels. And then you read in John, just in John chapter 10, we see the word sheep 14 times. So it's a large high percentage of the mention of the word sheep is actually in John chapter 10, and then the same with shepherds. There's 16, 5 of outside of the Gospels, and in the Gospel of John chapter 10, we see it mentioned 5 times. So this idea about shepherding and so on is really a powerful lesson. I'm going to have to get rid of this thing here. Sorry. It's driving me crazy. But we read here in Luke chapter 15, and I just want to go through just a few passages, and I just feel compelled to go through some of these because it is kind of the point that Jesus is using this analogy in John chapter 10, but it was not something unique to his teachings. And here he has the passage where Jesus is talking about somebody that has 100 sheep and one of them goes missing, that he's willing to go out and find his sheep, and that he puts it on his shoulder and he brings them home. And he uses that idea about how special a sheep is to a shepherd. We see in these other passages that Jesus talks about the people as they were standing around, and he makes this comment that they were bringing their people that were sick and people that needed to be healed. And when he saw the crowd, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Isaiah 40, again, similar passage again, and there, as I said, there's lots of passages in Isaiah, but in chapter 40, verse 11, he tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers his lambs in his arms, and he carries them close to his heart, and he gently leads those that have young. So, I don't have any sheep. I know that surprises you. I don't own any sheep. I don't really know, what I would do with one if I had one. But, the people that were in this area, sheep were just a part of their lives. They were part of their lives in a lot of ways. They were a part of their lives in that they offered them as sacrifices. But they obviously held a very special place in their heart for what a relationship with a sheep might be to the shepherd. Again, in Isaiah 53, in the passage that we're all so familiar with in verse 6, we are like sheep who've gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid our iniquities all on him. And then verse 7, he says, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and a sheep before her shearers is dumb, I think is the rest of this cut off. But anyway, but the idea here, even in this very familiar passage that sometimes we just flip through, that we might actually forget what that relationship is of a sheep. And we know that Jesus is ultimately the Passover lamb. And so Jesus is going to use that concept again when he's talking about himself, that he's going to lay down his life. So not only is he a sheep, he is also the shepherd. And then this passage in Psalms 23 that we all could quote. So the concept of Jesus and leading sheep is really important. Don't you love these little animations? I put a lot of work into these silly things. Okay, so if you would, turn to John chapter 10, and let's just read through the first part of this passage. And Jesus begins in chapter 10, verse 1, with these statements. I tell you the truth, that a man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber. The man who enters the gate is the shepherd of his sheep, and the watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away because they do not recognize the stranger's voice. And Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. So the fact that we might not understand what he's telling us might not surprise you completely, but I did want to highlight in this passage that I put in these verses here, and we'll come back to this here again in a second, but if you look at the words that we see in this passage in John chapter 10, at the very beginning, we see these are kind of the characters that are listed here. And it really does, this is kind of giving it all away, but we're going to try to make a little progress here. But this idea of these characters that you see as the symbols on the left-hand side of the Good Shepherd, the sheepfold, the gate, the other sheep, the gate, the gatekeeper, and the thief, and so on, is sort of an interesting sort of parallel of what Jesus is actually talking about. One that we just read about that I did not list here is the watchman at the gate. And I think that's probably speaking about the prophets that were the ones who were sort of overseeing the flock until Jesus comes as the good shepherd, and that his sheep follow him because they're his sheep. And they know that they're his sheep. We're going to come back to some of this concept in a minute or two because I think we have to answer some of these questions as we go through this. So we do see that in these passages, let me see where I am here real quick. So when you go starting in verse 7 and you move on through this passage, Jesus talks about that there are other people that come into trying to get the sheep and try to steal the sheep, and they're thieves and robbers. Those are probably the false Jewish teachers, and maybe he was specifically referring to the Pharisees. And then he goes on and he talks about that there's in verse 12, he talks about the hired hand. And so I put this little summary here because I think it is important to realize when you think about who he was talking about and how it is that it can be a little difficult to tell who these people are in our lives, or in the lives of the average person at the time of Jesus that was in that religious world that they were living in. It might be difficult to tell who the thief was, who the hired hand was, and who the shepherd was because of the circumstances. And we look at who the thief was. The thief has full intention of harming the sheep, and he only cares about himself, but he may not be seen for who he is because the circumstances that the sheep are in, as in they're all in the sheep pen and nobody's bothering them, you might not know who the thief was at that point. But when somebody comes in and actually declares themselves to be a thief, then you know that's the one. And he only cares about himself and he doesn't care about the sheep. And then Jesus makes that point about the hired hand. I don't know that he has a specific person that he would put in that category of being hired hand, but he has the appearance of someone who cares for the sheep because he's overseeing the sheep, he's watching the sheep. But when something bad happens, he abandons the sheep and leaves them for themselves. And again, I think there could be somebody who's seemingly watching over the sheep, but when push comes to shove, all of a sudden they just disappear, and leave the sheep to fend for themselves. If there's no experience or something that happens that makes that sheep, puts the sheep in jeopardy, you would not know whether the hired hand was the hired hand or whether he cared about the sheep or not. But the shepherd, on the other hand, he really cares about the sheep, and he's willing to give his own life for the sheep, and may only be recognized what he is until he dies for his sheep. So think about that statement, is that you look at Jesus, he's a good teacher, he's all these good things, and it is a teaching that we see run through in all the New Testament theological teachings anyway, is that the shepherd is willing to die for his sheep, and that is why he was referred to in the book of John as having his death equated to glorification. So John refers to when Jesus would say things about his death, he would pick up on those times that Jesus described that as not dying, but to be glorified. But we do see in this passage in chapter 10 that Jesus basically refers to all this as dying for his sheep. So Jesus says in verse 14, I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. So, this is just a picture of Jerusalem. Some people think this is the little sheep gate, but I don't know. But there's a sheep pen. So, as you go through these passages, we can go on here, and we've talked about this passage here. But as we go on and we see, though, when Jesus starts really making these comments, we see this common term brought up here in verse 20 when Jesus has said these things, and then what do they say? It says, you are demon-possessed and you are raving mad. Why do we listen to you? And then in reference to last week, look at verse 21. And you don't see this very often where some event that happened in the previous chapter is now referred to in the next chapter. I don't know that there's any place in the Synoptic Gospels that I actually think that we see that. But here we see in chapter 10, we see people that have watched all these things happen refer back to something that we read about in chapter 9, which is the opening the eyes of the blind. And I thought that was kind of interesting, that just all of a sudden he refers back to something. But I think it also lets you know that these people already know what's going on. Jesus didn't go around preaching to everybody that he brought sight to the blind man, but the blind man, his parents, maybe some of the Pharisees, maybe some of the people that were there, the apostles, who knows, but they were talking about what they were seeing. And they make this reference is that how could someone who's demon-possessed be a person that brings sight back to a blind person? So this idea of laying down his life for the sheep is really a critical idea for us, because John, again, is writing to people where he has got a point, and everybody that's reading this gospel already knows this happened. And so they're hearing this teaching of Jesus about his shepherdness and his willingness to lay down his life for his sheep. Verse 22 and beginning here, just a few thoughts about that real quick. Catch up here on my... So the Feast of the Dedication that we read about starting in verse 22, anybody know when that is? How do you know that? How do you know it's in the winter? I love these questions because it says it right here. So what is that? What is the Feast of the Dedication? We know what Passover is, right? You know what Passover is. We talked about the Feast of the Tabernacles or the tents or the booths, and here we have another festival. I think the people that live in Galilee, it's about 60 or 70 miles. It's like, oh man, it's like we just got back from Jerusalem. And they had to turn around and walk all the way back to Jerusalem because it's the Feast of the Dedication. So the Feast of the Dedication is in the wintertime, and it is sometimes referred to as the Feast of the Rededication of the Temple, which we would refer to as Hanukkah, which is right here in this December time. So we're in the lifetime cycle of Jesus. This is the last year. So we're in December, and Jesus is going to be offered up as a sacrifice sometime in that March, April time. So we're really coming into that last cycle of Jesus' life. He is in Jerusalem, and really the majority of the rest of this book is dedicated to that time in Jerusalem. We're going to find ourselves coming up pretty quickly into the last half of this book, which is almost all the last week of Jesus' life. So the first half of the book is the first 3 Passovers basically, and then the last half of the book is the last week. This is kind of an interesting calendar because we talk about things like Pentecost and the Day of Ascension. I don't know if you thought about that a few weeks ago, which is 40 days after Passover basically, Jesus ascended. So that was just recently. I think it's 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. So in this particular passage, Jesus he's kind of accosted by the Pharisees, and they ask him, said, just tell us, in verse 24, The Jews gathered around him, saying, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." So Jesus stops here and he says, "I did tell you, but you do not believe." And so he kind of expresses these ideas of these three events here. You know the kind of person I am. You know the words that I've used, and you have seen the miracles that I performed, and these are the evidences that you need to know that I'm the Christ. And they just still wouldn't believe. So that's the end of chapter 10. And there's just a few things I'd like to just bring up just for you if you want to ever think any more about these passages. In John chapter 10, there are just a few statements that Jesus makes that I just want to read out loud here to you. And Jesus, as I said, he does declare himself to be the Messiah. Verse 27, he tells us that my sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me, and I will give them eternal life, and they shall never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one can snatch them out of my Father's hand, and I and the Father am one. What does that mean? Think about the things that he said in these passages where he's talking about the sheep. And he says that here's a whole sheep pen full of sheep, but my sheep know my voice, and when I call them, they'll all follow me. So are there sheep in there that don't know his voice and they won't follow him? And there are sheep in there that do know his voice and they will follow him. It's an idea that I think you have to kind of think about what that actually means. And then you also have to think about the sort of what are the real advantages to being one of Jesus' sheep. First of all, you get eternal life, but no one can snatch you out of his hand. And I love that passage because it just shows how much Jesus is doing for those people. He loves his sheep, and no one is going to take them away from him. And who gave those sheep to him? The Father gave them to him. So when Jesus says that no one can snatch them from him, what does that mean? I love these passages where we see in the Bible, where John especially so, makes a comment about no one or everyone. He makes those kind of exclusive comments, and we've referred to that early on when we started this study, is because it's something that we see pretty frequently, that John seems to really pick up on that. I do think that there's just one passage that I would ask that you read at some point in time if you want to read more about that. Read Romans chapter 11, verse 29 and 32, and specifically the passages where Paul is talking about the nature of the saved, in a sense. And he's talking specifically about the Jewish people in that passage and the promises that were made to them, which I think are the equivalent to the promises made by us. So with that, you're going to watch me do a little PowerPoint alteration here. So, as promised, we're going to start another chapter. Any questions about any of that? Do notice, though, at the end that when Jesus makes that comment that he and the Father are one, think about what happened when Jesus in chapter 8 said they were going to stone him, right? Why were they going to stone him? What did he say right before they were going to stone him in chapter 8? He says, I am. So he makes that I am statement. So he's made several statements here about I am the good shepherd. So that's also on our list of I am statements. But what was the parallel there is that Jesus said, I and the Father are one. I mean, he makes another declaratory statement of who he is, and what are they going to do to him? They're going to stone him. But it doesn't say in this passage that it wasn't his time, which I found kind of interesting, but he did sort of disappear and they did not stone him. They were going to stone him because he was blaspheming at that time. So now we see at the very end of this chapter, that Jesus now went back across the Jordan to a place where John had been baptizing in the early days. Here he stayed, and many people came to him, and they said, though John never performed a miraculous sign, All that John said about this man was true, and in that place many believed in Jesus. So where are they? So this is important to kind of know, because we're going to see how it plays out in chapter 11. Is there on the other side of the Jordan. There's actually a city on the other side of the Jordan called Bethany also, and that's apparently where they were, because that's where John the Baptist was baptizing people. So in chapter 11, everybody in this room knows chapter 11 is about the raising of Lazarus, and I think that for us, we're going to kind of focus on that for as long as we can until we run out of time. So I'm going to move on through here. Here's a little animation of Lazarus. I thought that was kind of cute, so I had to throw that in there. I'm very visual. So this is the seventh sign of Jesus, and that's given in the book of John. And again, people like to divide this book up into these magic sevens, which actually doesn't work very much. But if you decide that this is the seventh sign, and you can list 6 before it, and you can neglect 2 or 3 other ones that happen to happen, you can kind of box it off into this 7th idea. But I don't think that plays out very well. So as we look back through the signs of Jesus, as presented in the Gospel of John, we see these are the list of things. Does anybody see the one that I actually left out? One of the other signs that people include in that is the clearing of the temple. So just in case you know. So here we've seen the official son been healed, the healing of the lame man, the feeding of 5,000, walking on the water, healing the blind man, and then raising of Lazarus. So what chapter is that occurring in? Chapter 11. How many chapters are there in the book of John? So there's 21. So we've kind of began coming to the end of part of the book that some people divide this up into the book of signs. Whether you like that division or not, I don't know, but it's the first half of John. The second half is not from the book of signs. So I think for us, looking at some of the ideas that we've seen play out in the book of John, is this idea of where we were and where Jesus will take us. We're in the dark, and Jesus wants us to be in the light. We're thirsty, he wants us to not be thirsty. We're hungry, he wants us to not be hungry. We have this life, but Jesus wants to give us a new life. We're lost but found, we're last but first. And in this passage, we go from this idea of being dead, and Jesus wants us to be alive. And these contrasts are very clear. And again, to me, the point of the entire book, or the way that John is making his points, is with this. So the raising of the dead, we do see that in several places, but in the New Testament, we see these 2 events. If Pam wants to write this down. Pam takes notes. Nobody else is taking notes, which says a lot. But anyway, just so you'll know. But this one is setting the stage in a different way, because this is the beginning of the end. And we find out at the end of this chapter that when the Pharisees see this, and they know that Jesus raised a person from the dead 3 days after he died, that they knew they had to do something. And it makes it plain as day in there at the end of this chapter that the Pharisees say, we got to get rid of him, and we got to get rid of Lazarus, which is interesting also. But setting the stage to this, these are our characters that we see in this story. We see Jesus, the apostles, Mary and Martha specifically, and then Lazarus, the family, and the mourners, which I always find them kind of interesting too. And the location is in Bethany near Jerusalem. So this is the Bethany on the west side of the Jordan River, as opposed to the Bethany that's in Perea on the east side. So we begin in chapter 11, and I'm going to show the video in a second, so I'm not going to read all this, but we do know that there was a man named Lazarus, and he was sick, and he was from Bethany, in the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So let's see. So this is a map, and I'm not going to talk about it, but if you will find that there's Bethany where they lived, but Jesus is probably over here somewhere, where John the Baptist was baptizing people on the other side of the Jordan, where that's referred to. What's up? He's doing that.
Many people came to him. John performed no miracles, they said, but everything he said about this man was true, and many people there believed in him. A man named Lazarus, who lived in Bethany, became sick. Bethany was the town where Mary and her sister Martha lived. This Mary was the one who poured the perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. It was her brother, Lazarus, who was sick. The sisters sent Jesus the message, "Lord, your dear friend is sick." When Jesus heard it, he said, "The final result of this sickness will not be the death of Lazarus. This has happened in order to bring glory to God, and it will be the means by which the Son of God will receive glory." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he received the news that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea."
Teacher, just a short time ago the people there wanted to stone you. And are you planning to go back?
The day has 12 hours. So those who walk in bold light do not stumble, for they see the light of this world. But if they walk during the night, they stumble, because they have no light. Martha and Lazarus is fallen asleep, but I will go and make him up.
If he is asleep, Lord, he will get well.
Jesus meant that Lazarus had died, but they thought he meant natural sleep, so Jesus told them plainly,
Lazarus is dead.
But for your sake, I am glad that I was not dead, so that you will believe.
Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples,
Let us all go along with the teacher, so that we may die with him.
So we'll watch the rest of this real quick, but just a couple of things that. So Jesus already knows that Lazarus has died, and I think that the idea of what Jesus said about the blind man when he was asked why was he blind, whether it was because of his parents or because of him, and he basically says it was really so that the glory of God could be shown to you. And here again, he's kind of saying the same thing. He says he's dead, and for your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe, but let's go to him. And then the comment that Thomas makes, which is, okay, let's go with him, because if he's going to die, well, let's go die with him, because they had remembered what had just happened in chapter 10, where Jesus was about to be stoned, and now he's not. And one other thing that we see is, which I'm not sure I see anywhere else in the Gospels, is a prequel. I mean, here in this statement in chapter 11, John makes reference to something that's going to happen in chapter 12, when Mary washes his feet. And so he makes reference of that. Oh, it's that Mary that I'm about to tell you about. So I find that kind of interesting, just as an aside. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'm going to start that again. Let me back up.
When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had been buried 4 days before. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Judeans had come to see Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother's death. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house.
If you had been here, Lord, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask him for.
Your brother will rise tonight.
I know that he will rise tonight on the last day.
I am the resurrection and the life.
Those who believe in me will live, even though they die. And those who live and believe in me will never die. Do you believe this?
I do believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world.
After Martha said this, she went back and called her sister Mary privately.
I didn't choose you. I was asking for you.
When Mary heard this, she got up and hurried out to meet him. Jesus had not yet arrived in the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. The people who were in the house with Mary, comforting her, followed her when they saw her get up and hurry out. They thought that she was going to the grave to weep there. Mary arrived where Jesus was, and as soon as she saw him, she fell at his feet.
Lord, you had been here, my brother would not have died.
Jesus saw her weeping, and he saw how the people with her were weeping also. His heart was touched, and he was deeply moved.
Where have you buried him?
Come and see, Lord.
Jesus wept. See how much he loved him, the people said.
So I'm going to interrupt this because all your children are going to be here in a minute. But I do think that a few things about this that I'd like for you just to think about is, we talk about how long Jesus had Lazarus had been dead, and we talk about stuff that you don't hear me say. But I do think that there's some of this concept of what John is trying to do with this book again is make that statement, or have people make those statements that you are the Christ. And what an amazing statement that is for somebody to make. I also think it's interesting that when Martha says that, I know that there's going to be the resurrection after this life, and that was what she thought Jesus meant. And I think sometimes we really forget that not everybody in that were Jewish people believed that. There were a fair number of people that did not have any concept of the resurrection. And so Jesus had obviously taught that concept of the resurrection as truth to these people, many of which did not believe that. And also the idea of some of the other stories that we read about and the healing of the official's son, Jesus didn't even go. He did that from where he was. And so again, Jesus knew Lazarus was sick. Jesus knew Lazarus was going to die, but he didn't select to do that miracle that way. He didn't select to do that for his friends. Again, why was that? Because this is a time where this event occurred so that these people could be impressed, in a sense, by the miracle that was about to occur. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but only in the way that it transitions us into this plot to kill Jesus that moves forward, starting in the latter half of this book. So, any questions? I'll be glad to answer those now or later, but in the meantime, we'll plan to see you next week.